She will also be pursuing a master's degree at the University of Regina this coming fall. She ultimately hopes that the project will become a long-term monitoring events. So with that, I'll let Jordan take it from here.
Alrighty. So I'm just making sure I have everything lined up.
Okay. No problem. And I'm still here in the background if you need a hand.
Perfect. So good evening, everyone. Like Kirsten said, my name is Jordan Rustad. I'm currently banner in charge at Last Mountain Bird Observatory. And for this past winter, I've been working with Ryan Fisher in the Royal Saskatchewan Museum on the Regina Urban Wildlife Project. And so that's what I'll be talking a little bit about tonight. Just to give you an idea of what I'm covering, I'm going to talk a little bit about the project. I'd like to introduce what urban wildlife actually is to you, and then talk a little bit about how we're collecting the data for our project, what we found so far, and how this contributes to conservation in cities. Okay, so what is the Urban Wildlife Project? Ultimately, the project aims to better understand urban wildlife in the city of Regina through passive monitoring using trail cams and audio recording units, or ARU, and bat detectors. And we also will be doing it through biodiversity surveys performed by citizen scientists. And we're hoping that this will help us document wildlife in an urban to rural gradient. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But right now, I kind of want to tell you what urban wildlife actually is. And so in a nutshell, urban wildlife refers to the animals that live in human-dominated ecosystems, like cities or towns. And animals generally use like natural to semi-natural habitats, such as cemeteries, like graveyards, parks, schoolyards, our backyards. And these types of green spaces are important for these types of animals, but they're also important for our own human well-being. And generally speaking, as urbanization increases, so the more buildings, more people, less green space, the less biodiversity we have. So that means less species overall. And this is kind of fairly intuitive for us. Like, just think if you're walking like in a natural space like Condi or White Butte versus walking like downtown Regina. You're obviously going to see like a lot less birds in downtown. But this doesn't always hold true. There's a few caveats to this. And so patterns of biodiversity change are not always consistent along that gradient. And this can be affected by a few different things, like the presence of habitat corridors. And Regina actually has a fair amount of green space. Like Wascana Park is one of the largest parks in North America. And the other things that kind of affect the patterns of biodiversity is the size of parks, which like Wascana Park is huge. The age of neighborhoods also affects biodiversity. Think like if you're going out in like the edges of Harbor Landing, where it's a very newer development, versus walking around the neighborhoods kind of around like the Science Center, you're getting a bit of a different types of species in those areas. And the other thing that can really affect this is tree cover. So how many trees are in the area, and this kind of plays into age of neighborhoods as well. And so there are actually four groups of urban wildlife. I won't really talk a lot about like human obligates or domesticated species, because I think we all know that these are basically the animals that won't do particularly well in the wild without human intervention. So think like our dogs and cats, like cows, sheep, those kind of species. but I do want to go into detail with the other ones. So starting off, we have associates or exploiters. These tend to be generalist species, so that just means that they're able to thrive in a variety of environments. They tend to be omnivorous, and they're able to take advantages of resources produced by humans, such as like our garbage bins, bird feeders, our gardens, and other things like that. And these food sources and habitats created by humans positively affect associates and exploiters. And this allows them to increase their populations in urban areas versus the wild. And this is partly because of increased food availability, but also because of decreased predation. And these generalist species are able to outcompete native species in urban environments. So some species for this class are viewed positively and some are negatively viewed, like hence the two names, associates versus exploiters. For example, like something like a songbird that comes and visits your feeders is going to be something you view quite positively in your yard versus like a raccoon digging through your garbage. And some really common species in this category are raccoons, house sparrow, rock doves or feral pigeons, American crow, and California gulls. The next group are called adapters. And these are animals that are able to use human spaces, but they don't necessarily receive a benefit from doing so. So you're not seeing a huge explosion of population. These species also tend to exist on the periphery of like rural and like urban developments rather than in the center. And generally speaking, these guys don't have histories of negative interactions with humans. And they also tend to be more generalist species as well. And so this group includes animals like skunks, robins, coyotes, deer, and foxes. The next group are called avoiders. And these will actively avoid human environments and are usually only seen in cities and urban areas during migration or dispersal. They tend to be specialists, meaning they need particular types of habitat in order to do well. They also have more of a history of negative interactions with humans, and they tend to have declines in their population in human-dominated landscapes. So just a few examples of these species, they tend to be very specific to the areas that we live in. So for Saskatchewan, these might include species like Sprague's pipit or ferruginous hawk or pronghorn antelope, and a lot of the other species that we typically associate with grasslands. And so why do we want to study urban wildlife? And there's a lot of reasons why urban wildlife research has been becoming more and more important. And first it's because cities are one of the fastest growing ecosystems on our planet. And habitat loss is a major driver of biodiversity loss and decrease in species populations. So we want to understand what species do well around cities and how we can mitigate the biodiversity loss that's offset by quickly growing cities. This research will also help us create better cities. It helps us to inform urban planning on where to include green spaces, how big the green spaces need to be. And we have to remember these green spaces also play an important part in the mental health of the people living in cities. It also helps to reduce or minimize the amount of negative interactions between people and wildlife. And so negative interactions, when we're talking about that can be like small mundane things like a raccoon gets into your trash, but it can also like escalate to like mountain lions, like stalking you or your dog on a walk. And we're trying to mitigate that as much as possible. And the reason we want to do this research in Regina specifically is because there's a real lack of research in prairie cities. And because Regina is so embedded in an agricultural landscape, it really creates a unique opportunity for us to study the urban wildlife that occurs here. So now I'm going to talk a little bit on how we actually collect the data. And I'm going to start off by talking about the passive monitoring using equipment. And so this is just a picture of one of the technicians, Eric, setting up equipment. And I wanted to bring this up because we had to set up this equipment in this giant pond without rubber boots. We didn't realize how flooded it would be. We were promised beverages by Ryan Fisher when we did this, and unfortunately they have not been delivered. And so the type of equipment that we were putting out, we were putting out automated recording units, and these are set up to record for 5 minutes at a time at particular times of the day. And for the October data collection round, they were set to run an hour before sunset, an hour before sunrise, an hour after sunrise, an hour before sunset, and an hour after sunset. We ended up analyzing an hour after sunrise and an hour before sunset in the end. And these, the AirUs were, unfortunately, they weren't set up during the January data collection because they just weren't able to operate in the cold too well. And the next piece of equipment we set up are the trail cams. And these are continuously running 7 days a week, and they're triggered by motion. So that just means they're going to snap pictures any time of the day. So currently there are 15 different stations set up. In October, there was only 8. There's one out at Condi. There is a site near the water treatment plant. There's one kind of south of the Royal Sask Museum's parking lot in the habitat conservation area, one near Sask Polytech, one on a site owned by George Gordon First Nation, and there was a site at White Butte as well. And then in January, the trail cams were set up at the same 8 stations, plus another 6 elsewhere and outside the city of Regina. So this included Joanne Goulet Golf Course, Arthur Park Regina Cemetery, north of the Regina Transit Center, Tor Hill Golf Course, and Murray Golf Course. And like I said, like I had kind of mentioned before, the recorders were not put out in January due to the equipment limitations at the extreme cold temperatures. So what have we found so far? So this is kind of a summary for the October and January trail cam photos. And so altogether, there was 3,883 unique images of wildlife and people using the areas around the monitoring sites. And all sites recorded images of wildlife. So this graph kind of shows the various species that were captured on camera. And these were actually like really exciting results for the project because they demonstrated that various wildlife species make use of all parts of the city. And it wasn't just concentrated in larger green spaces, but also in large and small green spaces. And so you can kind of see we got a lot of jackrabbits. That's kind of the biggest portion of that pie right there. Kind of followed by deer. And there was like quite a few different things, like mostly it was squirrels, raccoons, foxes, a few different gray partridges. But I do have like a few photos of these I'll show you after we kind of go through the AirU data a little bit. So for the audio recorder data, this only shows October because it's so far the only round that we've analyzed this data for. And so there was about 80 hours of audio recordings during the October monitoring period. And there was 37 different species of bird, in addition to the sound of cows and domestic dogs and like a few people talking. And some of the most common birds heard were geese, they were snow and Canada geese, followed by black-billed magpies and black-capped chickadees. Okay, so here are a few photos that the trail cams found. You're going to see like some of them are like really good, like this photo, like it's very clear that this is a white-tailed deer. And some, you know, they're okay quality. You can still tell that this is like some kind of cottontail rabbit. And then some photos are like this, where it's a thing, but we're not necessarily sure what it is. I think it might be a bird's butt, but who knows? And yeah, there was lots of pictures of deer, and because the trail cams are like motion detected, like you'd kind of click through the photos and it's almost like a still motion movie where the deer kind of slowly moves across the screen. Lots of jackrabbits in all of the sites. There's a few coyotes. They were another really commonly seen species. Raccoons were seen at a few different sites. You can kind of see them climbing up the tree in here. There's a few foxes kind of found here and there. There wasn't a ton of these guys. And a bird that was like really commonly seen on the trail cams were the Hungarian partridge or gray partridge. Just a small bone I'd like to pick here. These are not prairie chickens. Prairie chickens are a whole nother species. They are, lots of people refer to these as prairie chickens, and they are not prairie chickens, don't actually occur in Saskatchewan. But yeah, we know they're Hungarian partridge because it's kind of that grayish color around the breast and like that orange face. But yeah, they're the ones that are commonly seen kind of flushing as you walk. And there was one really cool and kind of unexpected sighting from the cameras in January. These guys are actually sharp-tailed grouse. And generally speaking, you will almost never see these guys in the city. To me, they would definitely be classified as an avoider species. And this kind of just highlights that, like this trail cam was actually right inside the city. So it wasn't one of the urban areas, but it was one of the urban green spaces that these guys were moving through. So this kind of, again, highlights that Regina green spaces are being used as corridors for wildlife as they move through areas. And kind of coming up soon. So our next round of data collection will begin in June, and we're hoping to catch lots of breeding birds in this round. We'll also be putting up the bat detectors this time. We'll be changing up the recording times a little bit too to make sure we're catching all those singing breeding birds as well as like other crepuscular species. We're also hoping to have more citizen scientists involved in this round, and that's kind of what I'll be talking about next. So this is the biodiversity monitoring by our citizen scientists. So that's the citizen science project I was kind of working on this past winter. And you can kind of think of it as a breeding bird survey light. So all the maps are already, or all the routes are already mapped out, and they're all separated by neighborhood. And the routes in the area, and routes are in areas with different amounts of urban cover. So some routes have like a fair amount of urban cover while others don't. And if we kind of zoom into one of the neighborhood maps, you can see like all the routes are labeled based on based off of what neighborhood they're in. And the routes are actually quite short. Like if you aren't seeing much and you're walking kind of at a decent pace, you could easily do it in 10 minutes, meaning you could probably do a few different routes in your neighborhood in a morning. And so we'd like these surveys to happen when the equipment is running. This kind of allows us to get more coverage and to pick up on any areas that aren't necessarily following the rules. Like I kind of talked about that urban to rural gradient. We kind of want to see where those rules break down, and is it true for this neighborhood versus this neighborhood. And we're also hoping to just get like that little bit of extra coverage in the cities and see if we're missing, like we know we're missing a few species, but just to kind of fill in some of the gaps that the passive monitoring has. And so here is a little snippet of the data sheet that will be used for the surveys. Obviously, we need to know what route you walked, what date you walked it. We also like to know like when you began and ended, just to give us an idea, like you spent like a lot of time versus just a little time on this route. Because obviously, if you're spending more time on a route, you have a chance of seeing more. We're also asking for a little bit of like weather information, just because that can affect the quality of your survey. And then after that, it's just the species you observed, how many you saw, and what they were doing. This kind of will allow us to get an idea of what animals are doing in the city and how they're using the spaces. So all of our protocols are online right now. They're currently available through this link to our Google Drive. And so this link has all of the protocol maps, including the whole city map, all the neighborhood maps, and the data sheet, and a cheat sheet as well, just in case you've never identified birds or animals before. We've also set up a Gmail account for the Urban Wildlife Project, so you can just shoot us an email that way too if you're interested in getting involved. The other thing that we're kind of hoping to collect are incidental observations. So if you don't really want to walk the routes, we're accepting incidental observations through iNaturalist. And the only rule for the incidental observations is that they have to be within the city of Regina. You can upload them any time of the year, regardless of whether the cameras are out or not. The other thing about incidental observations is we are accepting any life form on there. So we're not just accepting birds and mammals that you kind of saw like on the trail cams and the recordings. We're accepting everything. And this is because we are ultimately hoping to add more, more biodiversity to our list. And I did accidentally upload a few observations to this project during the City Nature Challenge. And so if anyone would like to knock me out of the top observer spot, I'd actually really appreciate that. I just wanted to give a shout out to some of our partners in this program so far. Obviously, the Royal Saskatchewan Museum has kind of got this project started. They partnered with the University of Regina and the City of Regina to kind of to get permissions and set up the cameras. Nature Regina for obviously employing me for this past winter and letting me create this protocol and kind of getting this off the ground. And the Friends of Wascana Marsh also partnered, the Provincial Capital Commission, EPCOR, Provincial Parks, George Gordon First Nation, all of those areas allowed us to put equipment up on their properties and have been really awesome and helpful and accommodating during these kind of early days of the project. So next I kind of want to talk about like what's some of the next steps. So we kind of have an idea of our standardized passive monitoring, but what else are we kind of looking for like in the near future? What are we doing? So kind of the next things on our horizon is really getting the citizen science project launched. We're hoping that we can have more people involved for the June and July data round and start getting more incidental observations through iNaturalist. And this is all because we want to create as many opportunities for research as possible. So I will be going to the University of Regina this fall and have this project as my thesis project for my master's. But we're hoping to create more opportunities for research with the incidentals and maybe get like a few honor projects for students out of it that way too. We'll also, like in addition to doing the summer monitoring, we'll also be setting it again in the fall in October. And we are looking at potentially adding more stations in the future as well. And this is because we would like to become part of the Urban Wildlife Information Network, like cities like Saskatoon and Edmonton have already done. This is just kind of a side note that I came across. So just like broadly Googling urban wildlife, and I don't think it should need to be said, but you should not try to pet coyotes or keep them as pets. It's a really bad idea, and I don't actually think it's legal in Saskatchewan to own a coyote. And with that, I will open the floor up for questions.
Thank you, Jordan. Elaine, do you mind stopping recording?